great partners with us here on the Todd Starnes radio program. All right, let's get into our first guest of the day, shall we, as we go to the Patriot Mobile Newsmaker hotlines. As we talk about the latest out of Ukraine and Russia, coincidentally, we haven't heard much from Washington, D.C. on a new funding bill. If you remember, just kind of a quick refresh, that they tried to tie it into an immigration bill. The immigration bill fell through a couple weeks ago. Then they tried to put it up on their own. Republicans said, yeah, no, we're still sticking to the fact that if we're going to help them fix their borders, we kind of need to fix our borders as well. And so far then, we haven't heard much of a conversation. They are passing appropriation bills right now. The first round of 6 appropriation bills passed last week. The second round being voted on throughout Congress this week as well. How much of that will be included with Ukrainian and Israeli funding? Only time will tell. But where should we be on this issue as we continue to see the bickering amongst those in Washington, D.C.? To talk about some of that and more, he's the author of the book, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. Happy to have on the show here Mr. Jason Jones. Jason, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing great, Andy. Thanks for having me on your show.
Yeah, you bet. Excited to have you on here with the Todd Starnes radio show. Let's talk about where we're at right now, because we haven't heard much news. We haven't heard much conversation about the funding, but we also haven't heard much out of Ukraine coming out either than they're beginning to lose ground, they're beginning to lose support, and they're desperate. Is that true? Are we really seeing Russia begin to make some ground in this ongoing conflict?
Yeah, we are. In fact, just yesterday, my organization, the Vulnerable People Project, has teams on the ground in Ukraine, and I've been to Ukraine several times since the invasion. A report from one of my team members yesterday was that morale is low, that Russia's beginning to take ground, and the tide is beginning to turn. Of course, in the first weeks after the invasion, there was an opportunity for a ceasefire, and the West, lured Ukraine into deeper and deeper waters in this billions of dollar grift, really at the expense of the people of Ukraine. So now we're in a situation where it appears that the war is lost. And General Milley said, if you remember, just 2 months after the war began, when he was asked, do you really think Ukraine can win? And General Milley's response was, we don't need Ukraine to win. What we need is a quagmire. And I think that's, in my new book, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset, it was in Ukraine where I really saw how brutal and vicious and anti-human our ruling elite are, because you can go to hospitals in Ukraine, and I visited a hospital that was an old Soviet prison. It was a huge old Soviet prison, and in every room were several boys missing arms, missing legs, and this is the cost of the grift.
Yeah. It is concerning. If they're losing ground and if it's potentially lost right now, let's just say that we end up spending some money to send more resources over to Ukraine. Would that help at the time? And I guess so many conservatives have this concern about if we need to, make America first. We need to make that priority. And I understand it, and I've supported that as well. I know other nations and over in Europe have been trying to support Ukraine at the same time. Are we the only one sending support, and why is our funding and our support so vital to this success to try and keep Vladimir Putin at bay?
No, that's not true. And I get really frustrated with a lot of the commentary on the right regarding Ukraine, because it really plays into the deep state's campaign. We really should have been working to advance the interests of the people of Ukraine. If they could have won the war, win the war. If they can't win the war, a ceasefire and get the best deal possible for the people of Ukraine. But what General Milley made very clear is, and this is what many conservatives feel instinctively, and that's why they're repulsed by the whole thing, is that this was never about the people of Ukraine. This was about advancing the perceived interests of Germany, the other NATO countries, and the United States at the expense of the people of Ukraine. And so they're frustrated by that. And I completely understand that frustration. But what they need to understand is that when they say, we're sending all of this money to Ukraine, we're not sending money to Ukraine. We're sending weapons to Ukraine, paid for with our money, to be put into the hands of young Ukrainian boys who are going to die. And this idea that other countries aren't engaged, I think number 2 in casualties in this war have been Poland. Young men are many companies of young men from Poland have gone and have fought and died in Ukraine to defend Ukraine from Russian aggression. So there's a lot of misinformation I understand the frustration from the right, but one thing that they also need to understand is that when Russia takes ground, the first thing they do is they close the evangelical churches. And this is a story that has not been told. In occupied Ukraine, every evangelical church has been closed. In occupied Ukraine, most of the Catholic churches have been closed. And in occupied Ukraine, if you're an Orthodox church unaligned with Moscow, the priests have been tortured and killed. So there's a lot at stake. And sadly, it, just as we saw in Afghanistan, the powers of the world are not actually interested in the plight of the people of Ukraine, but they're advancing their own interests.
Yeah, it is concerning. Now, you said that you've obviously been over there working on humanitarian issues, seeing some of the devastation that's going on. Talk about some of the stuff. You mentioned some of the hospitals, but what else have you seen over there? And with I was not aware that churches were being closed, which is a major cause for concern, because Vladimir Putin says that he's religious and that he's Christian, and they have all these great churches in Russia, but they're closing them down in Ukraine. That's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and Ukraine has more Orthodox churches than Russia. Ukraine is the most conservative Christian country of the former Soviet republics. It has the largest pro-life movement in Europe. In fact, it was a great tragedy. When I spoke in June in Ukraine at a conference, there was a young man. He had been the leader of the pro-life movement in Western Ukraine. He had been actually out of Ukraine going to college, but as soon as the invasion happened, he returned home, became a special forces officer, spoke at a pro-life, pro-family event with me in Kyiv in June, and 11 days later, he died on the front. So what we're seeing is, Ukraine's losing a generation. And, I'm hoping with this presidential election year coming up, we're going to have a real serious discussion on what's been happening in Ukraine. Because like you said, the people in the United States are not seeing the true story. We're not seeing the cost of this war. Yeah. We're not seeing the real human cost of this war. We're not seeing the cost to the people of Ukraine. And, but again, I wrote this book because with my work on the front lines of these wars for the past 20 years, I was in Iraq with the rise of ISIS. I've been in Afghanistan for the past 2 years, serving the widows and orphans of our Afghan allies who were killed in action and evacuating our former allies who were abandoned by the Biden administration. I've been able to see up close and personal the brutality of the deep state and their thoughtlessness to the human cost of their policies. But no place can this be better seen than in Ukraine. And tragically, I think it's going to become very clear to everyone the real human cost of this war for the past 2 years, over 2 years.
Yeah, it's a cause for concern. We're talking with Jason Jones. He's author of the book, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. What's your thoughts on the interview that Tucker Carlson was able to do with the sit-down with Vladimir Putin? When he did this, it was surprisingly near 2 hours long and talked about this entire history, which I found kind of odd, but kind of fascinating at the same time, about the history of the whole region and how they came to be and how they were fine. And really, it came down to the ultimate point that he said that he wanted nothing more than the couple regions that were near the border of Russia, that he wanted to fight Nazism, because apparently the Ukrainians were upholding Nazism and fascism in the nation, and that he wanted to keep a border between NATO. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, no, well, definitely. I mean, his point to NATO ever encroaching east has some weight to it. His history lesson was quite absurd. I mean, anyone from Ukraine or from Russia would have laughed at his history lesson. I want to say this. I'm glad that Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin. The real tragedy is this hasn't been the 100th interview with Putin by our media. It was such a big deal because this hadn't been done, which is striking, and it tells you where we are. But there was a lot of foolishness. His history lesson was a myth. And in fact, it was a myth in inverse, because Russia really came out of Ukraine. But he left out some very important things. For example, he left out the Holodomor. When talking about the history between Russia and Ukraine, and you start in the 600s, I turned to my wife. I said, my ancestors were still in Norway. They hadn't invaded France yet, let alone headed to England. This is where he starts. So, okay, where are my ancestors in the story? But then he leaves out the forced famine in the 1930s, where Russia forcibly starves over 6 million Ukrainians. And if you want to understand the relationship between Ukraine and Russia, you really have to start with the Holodomor. In fact, it's important to remember that when Ukraine voted for independence, even those oblasts that Putin wants, those Russian-speaking oblasts to the east, voted overwhelmingly to be a part of Ukraine. And even though they didn't speak Ukrainian, those oblasts to the east also voted at the same time overwhelmingly to make Ukrainian their official language. They didn't even speak Ukrainian. And why is that? Because even in those eastern oblasts, there was a real antipathy towards Russia and a fear of Russia. And so Putin's little myth leaves out really one of the most important parts of the story. And then again, talking about religious freedom, Russia has this long history of religious freedom. I mean, that's absurd. We all know the history of the pogroms. And sadly, and it's quite striking, that the brutality towards the evangelical church by Putin is not being covered in the media. I think the mainstream media doesn't care that Christians are being brutalized in occupied Ukraine. And it may not fit the narrative for some on the right. But the real tragedy is that Ukraine is the most Christian country of all the former republics, with the largest, most active pro-family, pro-life movement. I was in Ukraine this past June. In June, the only rainbow flag I saw in Ukraine in June was at the Canadian Embassy. And when I crossed the border back into Poland, of course, there were rainbow flags everywhere. I went there from Poland to Germany, rainbow flags everywhere. So this idea that Ukraine is this hard left country, it's the opposite. It's a country of conservative farmers, Christian farmers. Our State Department and Germany are taking the opportunity of the war to try to radically change Ukrainian culture. And it's quite frustrating. So we as conservatives should stand with the Christians in Ukraine against Russian, not only against Russian aggression, but also against the aggression of sort of Western imperialism that's seeking to change their culture.
Yeah, it is a cause for concern. Jason, we got just about a minute left here before we have to let you go. But with election time, Donald Trump, former president, has mentioned that if he gets back in office, that he could end this conflict immediately, that he'd be able to walk in and be able to create the peace negotiations, have the conversation with both Ukraine and with Russia, and stop the madness because he just wants people to stop dying, is what he said during those conversations. Is that true? And do you think that he can actually pull that off? We know that Joe Biden obviously has disastrous foreign policy, regardless of where people stand on Ukraine. But I mean, how we've done every foreign policy bit by Joe Biden has been a disaster. Can Donald Trump get us back on track, do you think?
He did it. I was in Iraq with the rise of ISIS, traveling with the Peshmerga as they were defending the ancient Christian communities and Yazidi communities of Iraq from ISIS genocide. Within 72 days of being sworn in as president, ISIS in Iraq was reduced to one cave in a hole somewhere, and the people the women were liberated from the ISIS rape camps. The Christians could leave the IDP camps. So yeah, he did it once, and I believe he will do it again. I have to say, I've been working on the front lines with genocide, democide, and war for over 20 years. And the past 3 years, we've done more work. Sadly, we've had to do more work in more places than the previous 20 years combined. So I'm really looking forward to this election. And obviously, it's important at home, but the costs around the world are also their life or death.
We have a lot of work to do for sure. And like you said, battling the misinformation is a ongoing battle that we see on many different levels and many different topics for sure. So Jason Jones, The Great Campaign Against the Great Reset. You can check it out on Amazon, other places as well. Jason, we appreciate the time very much, my friend. Let's do it again soon.
All right. Thanks, Andy.